The war room of the Galactic Conclave smelled of ozone and fear. 17 civilizations sat around a table carved from the bones of a dead star, and every single one of them was staring at the same data feed. The numbers didn't lie. Humanity, that small, loud, chaotic species clinging to a wet rock in an unremarkable corner of the Milky Way, had just broken the light barrier. Elder Surrak of the Veth Kai pressed 4 of her 6 fingers together in the gesture her species used when they were trying not to panic. They weren't supposed to do that for another 300 years, she said quietly. They weren't supposed to split the atom for another 200 years either, replied Admiral Vethkaron, his pale eyes scanning the report. And yet, here we are. No one laughed. The Conclave had been watching humanity for 6,000 years, not out of affection, out of caution. Every civilization at that table had, at some point, made the mistake of ignoring a developing species until it was too late. The Dravoshi had nearly been wiped out by the Qatari that way. The Ohm Collective still carried the scars of the Breach War, started by a species that had gone from stone tools to antimatter bombs in 8 centuries. Humanity had done it in 4. The motion is on the table, said High Chancellor Vron, his deep voice cutting through the murmurs. We neutralize the threat, now, before they reach their first colony ship, before they spread. The vote took 11 seconds. Unanimous. In the sublevels of Conclave Command, in a chamber kept at near absolute zero, they woke the Voakai. It took 6 hours just to sedate it enough to load it into a containment vessel. The Voakai was not built. It was grown, over 3 centuries, by the finest biological engineers the Conclave had ever produced. It was 400 meters of layered muscle and ancient hunger, wrapped in a hide that had survived direct hits from battleship-class weapons. It had no eyes. It didn't need them. It found prey by sensing the electromagnetic signature of a beating heart, and it had never once failed to destroy what it was sent after. They gave it a single directive, encoded directly into its neural core. Go to the 3rd planet of Star System Sol. Eliminate all life. The containment vessel entered FTL. 17 hours later, it arrived in the Sol system. And then nothing. No signal, no confirmation of mission completion, no emergency beacon. The Voakai carried 12 redundant tracking systems, each one independent, each one designed to survive even the destruction of the creature itself. Every single one went dark at the same moment, somewhere over the blue-green planet below. Surrak leaned over her console, checking the data 3 times, then a 4th. It's not dead, she whispered. What? Vron turned to her sharply. The Voakai. She looked up, and for the first time in 400 years of life, Surrak looked genuinely uncertain. Its biosignature is still present, it's alive, it's just not responding. The room erupted. Voices overlapped in 6 different languages. Admiral Vethkaron slammed a fist onto the console and demanded a full reconnaissance sweep. Vron called for silence 3 times before he got it. A junior analyst in the back row quietly excused himself to be sick in the corridor. Because the Voakai had never not responded. In 2,000 years of deployment across 14 systems, across wars and purges and planetary pacifications that had reshaped the political map of the galaxy, the Voakai had never once gone quiet. It took 48 hours to assemble a drone swarm and push it towards Sol at maximum speed. 48 hours of waiting, of silence, of the 17 most powerful civilizations in the known galaxy staring at a dead feed and trying very hard not to think about what it meant. Vethkaron didn't sleep. He stood at the observation window in his private quarters and watched the stars, and for the first time since he was a young soldier on his first campaign, he felt something cold moving slowly up his spine. Not anger. Not strategy. Fear. Because there were things in this universe that could kill the Voakai. Several, in fact, the Conclave had catalogued most of them, but killing it would have left a trace, an explosion, a debris field, something. The absence of anything at all was so much worse. When the drone feeds finally came back online, and the first images resolved on the main screen, the war room fell into a silence so complete that Surak could hear the hum of the ventilation system 3 floors up. The Vorkai was alive. It was lying on its back, on a grassy field somewhere in the northern hemisphere of the human homeworld. And a small human child, no taller than Surak's knee, was scratching the underside of what had once been its primary killing tendril. The tendril was wagging. Vethkaran stared at the feed for a very long time. Then he turned to the room, his voice completely flat, and said, "Get me 300 warships." Drone feeds kept coming, and every new image made things worse. Analyst Thairn 7 of the Conclave Intelligence Division had been doing this job for 60 years. He had reviewed footage of massacres, planetary collapses, civilizations ending in fire and silence. He was not, by any reasonable definition, a squeamish individual, but as he sat in the dimly lit monitoring bay and watched the feeds from Earth roll in one after another, he found himself doing something he hadn't done since his training years. He started keeping a personal log. Day 1, Feed 7, the Vorkai designation W1 in mission files, has been given a name by the human family that appears to have claimed it. Facial recognition on the adult male of the household confirms the name spoken most frequently in its direction is Gerald. The Vorkai responds to this name. I have reviewed the footage 6 times. It responds to this name. Day 1, Feed 12. W1 has consumed approximately 40 tons of raw livestock provided by what appears to be a coordinated effort from neighboring settlements. Humans from at least 4 separate communities have been observed delivering food. They are taking photographs with W1. Some are smiling. W1's secondary sensory tendrils, previously documented as pre-attack threat assessment appendages, are resting loosely at its sides. Biometrics indicate a complete absence of hunting aggression. I don't have a clinical term for the state it's currently in. The closest equivalent in my notes is content. Day 2, Feed 3. A female human, approximately 8 years old by their developmental standards, has braided something into W1's dorsal hide. I have spent an hour trying to determine whether this constitutes a weapon or a restraint. It is a flower chain. She has put a flower chain on the Vorkai. Thairn 7 closed his log and pressed his hands flat on the console, breathing slowly. The biosignature analysis that Surak had flagged on Day 1 was now fully processed, and the results had come back from 3 separate independent labs, all saying the same thing. The Vorkai's neurological profile had changed. The deep architecture aggression pathways, the ones burned into its genome at the cellular level by 3 centuries of deliberate engineering, were showing significantly reduced activity. They weren't gone. The creature was still, fundamentally, what it had been built to be. But something had happened at the surface level. Something had, in the span of less than 48 hours, begun to smooth over the top of all that engineered violence like water filling in a footprint. Surak called it domestication in her official report. Then she crossed it out and wrote behavioral restructuring. Then she crossed that out too, and after a long pause wrote simply, "I don't know what to call this." Because domestication implied the humans had done something deliberate, had applied some technique, some technology, some weapon of their own, but the feeds showed nothing like that. No devices, no chemicals, no restraints of any kind. What the feeds showed was a child sitting beside the largest, most lethal bioweapon ever constructed by intelligent life, reading to it from a paper book, while her father grilled food on an open flame nearby, and her mother laughed at something on a small handheld screen. They weren't afraid. That was the detail that kept stopping Thairn 7 cold, the one he came back to over and over as he scrubbed through hours of footage. Every other species that had ever encountered the Vorkai, even in simulation, even in historical records, had registered immediate, overwhelming terror. It was by design. The Vorkai projected something, some low-frequency biological signal that bypassed conscious thought and went straight to the hindbrain. Pure, ancient, get-away-from-this-thing instinct. Humans, apparently, did not have that particular switch. Or if they did, And the neurological data suggested they did, suggested they absolutely felt the signal. They had simply decided not to obey it. That distinction seemed important, though Thairn 7 couldn't fully articulate why. He flagged it in his report with a note that said further study required and moved on, because the alternative was sitting with the implications, and he didn't have time for that. By day 3, W1 Gerald had been moved to a larger field. Local authorities had established a perimeter, not to contain the creature, but to manage the humans who kept showing up to see it. The queue stretched for 2 kilometers, families, scientists, children with hand-drawn signs. Feed 31 captured a moment that Thairn 7 would later describe, in his eventual memoir, as the single most disorienting thing he had witnessed in 6 decades of intelligence work. An elderly human woman, moving slowly with a walking aid, approached the Vokai alone while the crowd held back. She reached up. The creature had to lower itself significantly, bending what passed for its neck, and she put her palm flat against its hide and said something too quiet for the audio pickup to catch. The Vokai went completely still. Then it made a sound, low, resonant, a frequency the monitoring equipment barely registered. Thairn 7 had to run it through audio analysis twice to confirm it hadn't been a malfunction. It was purring. He filed his report. He included everything. He did not editorialize, did not speculate beyond what the data supported, did not allow himself to say what he was actually thinking. What he was actually thinking was, "We have made a terrible mistake, and I'm not sure it's the one we think it is." Admiral Veth Caron had never lost. This was not a boast. It was a documented, verified, cross-referenced historical fact that spanned 240 years of active service and 12 separate military campaigns across 4 galactic sectors. He had pacified civilizations. He had ended wars in a single afternoon. He had once looked at a species that had resisted the conclave for 3 generations and broken their resistance in 72 hours without deploying a single ground unit. He was, by every reasonable measure, the most dangerous military mind in the known galaxy. He stood on the bridge of the Eternal Mandate, his flagship at the head of a fleet of 300 warships stretching behind him like a second sun, and he felt completely, utterly calm. "They got lucky with the Vokai," said his second-in-command, Commander Ekhan, standing 2 steps to his left with a data tablet in hand. "Biological weapon. Unpredictable variables. It happens." "It doesn't happen," Veth Caron said flatly. "The Vokai has never been diverted from a directive, not once in 2,000 years. Then perhaps it malfunctioned." Veth Caron didn't answer. He watched the stars through the forward viewport and thought about something that had been sitting at the back of his mind since the drone feeds came back. Not the flower chain. He could rationalize the flower chain. Not even the purring biology was complex. Unknown variables existed. What he couldn't stop thinking about was the speed. The Vokai had arrived in the Sol system with a single directive burning in its neural core. A directive that had been encoded at a level deeper than instinct, deeper than thought, woven into the creature's very cellular identity. And in less than 48 hours on that planet, surrounded by a species that had never once encountered it, that directive had simply stopped mattering. 48 hours. 3 centuries of engineering undone in 48 hours. He filed the thought away and returned to the present. The fleet crossed the heliopause at 600 hours, and almost immediately, the long-range sensors picked up the contact. One ship. A single human vessel sitting in the outer system, running lights on, moving at what his tactical computer described with almost insulting accuracy as leisurely patrol speed. It was small, barely the size of one of his destroyers, and it was constructed in a way that didn't match any known human design template in the Conclave database. Smooth, angular, matte black, with no visible weapon ports. It hailed them before they got within communication range. "Incoming Conclave fleet," said the voice on the channel, speaking flawless Conclave standard with a very slight accent. "This is Captain Yusuf Adami of the EFS Immovable. I'm going to ask you nicely to stop where you are and consider turning around. I want to be clear that I'm asking nicely. A brief pause. This is the asking nicely part. Veth Karan studied the vessel for a moment. Then he opened the channel. This is Admiral Veth Karan of the Eternal Mandate. You are one ship. We are 300. Move aside or be destroyed. Another pause. When the human spoke again, there was something in his voice that Veth Karan would later spend a great deal of time thinking about. Not fear, not bravado. Something that sounded almost like patience. "All right," said Captain Adami. "I gave you the chance." Veth Karan closed the channel and turned to his weapons officer. "Fire." The first volley was a standard suppression spread, 40 plasma bolts from the lead ships, enough energy collectively to crack a small moon. They crossed the distance in seconds and then, approximately 40 meters from the hull of the immovable, they stopped. Not deflected, not absorbed, not dispersed. Stopped. 40 bolts of coherent plasma, each moving at a significant fraction of light speed, simply hung in space like frozen lanterns. They held their shape perfectly. Their energy readings remained constant. They had not struck anything. There was no visible field, no barrier, no evidence of any technology between the weapons and their target. On the bridge of the Eternal Mandate, no one spoke. Then three things happened very quickly. The plasma bolts rotated in place, aligning themselves back toward the fleet. They returned at precisely the velocity at which they'd been fired, and three ships, the Conclave's Reach, the Iron Devotion, and the Sorrow of Katara, ceased to exist. In the silence that followed, the channel from the immovable opened again. "I've got coffee," said Captain Adami. "Good coffee. I'm going to sit here and drink it. Whenever you're ready to talk, I'm here. And Admiral, I'd recommend not firing again. I'm only going to reflect the next one's back too, and I'd hate for you to lose more ships." Veth Karan looked at the readouts. He looked at the frozen, untouched hull of the small human ship. He looked at the spaces where 3 of his vessels had been. "Hold fire," he said. His voice was perfectly steady. "All ships hold fire." He sat down in his command chair, something he almost never did during engagement, and pressed his hands flat on his knees and breathed. "Get me Conclave Command," he said quietly, "and get me every physicist we have on this fleet. I want to know what just happened." Message from the fleet arrived at Conclave Command at 4:12 hours, and by 4:30, every light in the building was on. Researcher Ovan had been asleep for exactly 90 minutes when her communicator pulled her back to consciousness. She was the Conclave's foremost theoretical physicist, a title that had always felt slightly embarrassing in its grandiosity until right now, when it apparently meant she was the one who had to explain why 3 warships had been destroyed by their own weapons bounced off a ship that, according to all sensor data, had done absolutely nothing. She sat in the emergency briefing room with 17 other scientists, all of them staring at the same data package, all of them doing the same thing, reading it once, setting it down, and picking it up again, as if a second reading might make it say something different. It never did. "Topological inversion," said a young researcher from the Dravoshi delegation, whose name Ovan could never quite remember. He said it slowly, the way someone says a word they've only ever seen written down. "That's not possible," said the Qatari physicist across the table. "No," agreed the young researcher, "it isn't." Ovan pressed her fingertips together and forced herself to be methodical about this. Topological inversion mechanics, the theoretical framework in which the geometry of local spacetime could be selectively redirected, had been a known theoretical possibility for about 400 years. Every civilization in the conclave had explored it at some point. Every civilization had hit the same wall. The energy requirements were so astronomical, and the computational precision required was so extreme, that the practical applications were essentially zero. You could describe it mathematically. You could demonstrate it worked in models. Actually doing it in the physical world was another matter entirely. Or so they'd thought. "Walk me through what they actually built," she said. The young researcher pulled up the reconstructed schematics, assembled from the drone sensor data, from the weapon's impact analysis, from everything Vern's 7 team had captured. The device, as best they could determine, was compact. Not compact in the sense of small for what it does. Compact in the sense of fits in a room. The room went very quiet. "That's not possible either," said the Qatari physicist. "I know," said the young researcher. Ovan looked at the schematics for a long time. Then she started asking questions, detailed, technical questions. And as the answers came back, she felt something happening in her chest that she recognized from early in her career, before decades of professional distance had smoothed it over. It was the feeling of standing at the edge of something vast and not being able to see the bottom. Because the device wasn't just impressive. It wasn't just an unexpected leap. It was the product of an entire branch of physics that the conclave had never developed. Not because it was beyond them, the fundamental principles were the same, but because they had taken a different fork in the road 400 years ago and never looked back. Humanity had taken the other fork. And then they had run. By the end of the briefing, the room had the specific atmosphere of a place where everyone understands the same thing and nobody wants to say it first. Ovan understood this dynamic and had no patience for it. "The weapons we have aren't going to work," she said plainly. "Any kinetic or energy-based weapon can theoretically be inverted and returned. Depending on how refined their application is, they may be able to do it selectively, choose which weapons to return, at what velocity, to what target. We are, in practical terms, unable to harm them from range using anything in our current arsenal." Silence. "What about close range?" someone asked. "Kinetic impact at close range is still a kinetic event," Ovan said. "Same principle applies." More silence. "Biological, chemical." "We sent a biological weapon first," Ovan said. "It's living on a farm now. Its name is Gerald." She gathered her notes. "I'll have a full report on your desks within 6 hours. I'll also be submitting my resignation alongside it." Someone looked up sharply. "Resignation, why?" Ovan picked up her data tablet and looked at the schematics one more time. At the elegant, impossible, infuriatingly compact device that a species the conclave had dismissed as primitive had quietly built in some unremarkable facility on their unremarkable planet. "Because I spent 400 years being the smartest physicist in the room," she said, "and I find I no longer believe that's true." She walked out. The report, when it arrived, was comprehensive, clinical, every number correct, every conclusion supported by the evidence. The final line read, "I no longer feel qualified to speculate on what they cannot do. They had no names." This was not a metaphor. The 7 individuals assembled in the briefing room of Conclave Intelligence's most classified facility had, at various points in their careers, officially ceased to exist. Their genetic records had been purged, their biographical files erased, their identities dissolved so thoroughly that even they, if asked, could only answer to designations. They were called the Shades. The conclave had built them over generations, not biologically, but institutionally. Each one had been selected in childhood from the populations of different member civilizations, chosen for a specific, rare convergence of neurological traits, extreme adaptability, exceptional pattern recognition, near total suppression of fear response, and what the psychologists who evaluated them clinically described as a preternatural ability to become whatever a situation requires. They had never failed a mission. In 300 years of operation, through political assassinations and intelligence extractions, and the deliberate, surgical destabilization of governments too troublesome to fight directly, the Shades had a perfect record. Director General Vox briefed them personally, which was unusual. He stood at the head of the table and laid out the situation with characteristic bluntness. The Volkai had failed. The fleet had failed. The physics division was in crisis. The target was a woman named Elena Vasquez, director of Earth's Strategic Defense Initiative, and she was, by all available analysis, the single human most responsible for the defensive architecture that had made Earth effectively impenetrable. Remove her, Vox said, and the system loses its architect. It will take them years to reconstruct, years we can use. The Shades looked at the files. They asked a few precise, professional questions, then they went to work. Their infiltration of Earth was, by any technical standard, flawless. They entered through 3 separate vectors over a period of 2 weeks, using identities assembled from genuine human records, speaking languages with no detectable accent, carrying no technology that would register on human scanning equipment. Shade 2 got within 40 meters of Vasquez on day 4. Shade 5 established a surveillance position that gave a direct sightline to her office window. Then things began to go sideways in ways that didn't fit any pattern. Shade 3 reported, on day 6, that he had experienced what he described as unusual social interactions with a woman in his cover location, who seemed to ask questions that were extremely specific without appearing to be interrogating him. He filed it as a low-level concern. He did not break cover. On day 8, Shade 6's feed showed her sitting in a small restaurant, mid-mission, across from a human man who was apparently just a neighbor of her cover identity, and who was, somehow, asking about her childhood. Her real childhood, not her cover story's childhood. Her actual one, which she had not thought about in 20 years and had certainly not disclosed. She stayed at the table. She filed nothing. On day 11, Shade 1 reached the outer perimeter of Vasquez's compound, the final approach. He was 40 minutes from the target. His feed showed a clear path, no anomalies, no obstacles. Then it showed him sitting down on a low wall at the compound's edge in the dark and not getting up. He sat there for 6 hours. His report, filed the next morning, consisted of 4 words: "I need more time." This had never happened. Shades did not need more time. Shades had no hesitation, no second thoughts, no human variables that could pull them off a directive. That was the entire point of them. One by one, over the following 3 days, the feeds went dark. Not with alarms, not with violence, not with the sudden static of a compromised operative. They went dark the way a conversation goes quiet when it turns to something real, gradually, deliberately, because the person holding the communicator had something more important to attend to. The last feed was Shade 4's. It showed her in a well-lit kitchen, sitting across a table from a small woman with gray-streaked hair and reading glasses and a cup of tea. The small woman was talking. Shade 4 was listening with an expression that the analysts reviewing the footage later described, uncomfortably, as relief. The feed cut out. 4 days of silence followed. Then, transmitted simultaneously from 7 different locations across the Earth's surface, a joint communique arrived at Conclave Intelligence Headquarters. It was written in 7 different languages, one for each shade in their original native tongue, which no one outside this building was supposed to know they had. It read, "We are not returning. We have disclosed everything we know about Conclave operations to the relevant human authorities. This is not coercion. We have not been threatened, drugged, or psychologically manipulated in any way that we can identify. We are making this choice freely. We are aware of how that sounds. Do not send replacements. And for what it's worth, you were always wrong about them." Director General Vox read the communique 3 times. Then he walked to his private office, locked the door, and sat in the dark for a very long time. He was trying to identify the weapon, the technique, the specific mechanism by which 7 of the most psychologically armored individuals ever produced by the Conclave had been neutralized without a single act of force. He couldn't find it. Because there wasn't one. High Emissary Rel was 412 years old, and he had learned, over those 4 centuries, to walk into any room in the universe and immediately understand its power structure. He could tell within 60 seconds who deferred to whom, who resented whom, who was performing confidence and who actually had it. He could read the architecture of authority in the way people held their bodies, poured their drinks, chose their seats. It was the skill that had made him the conclave's greatest diplomat, not language, not law, not the encyclopedic knowledge of treaty precedent that filled 3 rooms of his personal archives. Just this, the ability to look at a room full of people and see, immediately and clearly, how the world looked from inside each of their heads. He walked onto Earth's orbital station, expecting to use that skill immediately. He didn't get the chance. The welcoming delegation was waiting in the docking bay when his shuttle arrived, and they were unremarkable. A woman named Chen Wei who introduced herself as ambassador, 3 aides, a station commander. No visible weapons, no ceremonial guards, no display of status or force. Chen shook his hand with both of hers, a human gesture he recognized from the briefing files as indicating genuine warmth, not formal courtesy, and said, in perfect conclave standard with the precise regional accent of the capital district, "High Emissary, we're glad you came. We've been hopping someone wood for a while now." The accent stopped him, not just the fluency, the accent. Acquiring it required immersion, not study. It required time spent in the capital district, listening to how people actually spoke, the small elisions and rhythms that no language course ever captured. He had no idea how she had managed it, and he filed that away and smiled and followed her to the reception hall, where the table was set with food. He recognized food from his home region specifically, not generic conclave cuisine, and the lighting had been adjusted to the spectrum his species found most comfortable. He had been expected. Not just anticipated, expected, the way you prepare for a guest you know well. Over the first meal, he tried the standard openings he used with every new counterpart, vague references to mutual interest, carefully non-committal assessments of the situation, statements designed to invite the other party to reveal their priorities. Chen met every one of them with something that took him a moment to identify as simply answering the question he was actually asking, rather than the one he had appeared to be asking. It was disorienting. On the second day, he asked about the fleet, specifically about the immovable and what had been done to his ships. "Self-defense," Chen said. "We gave fair warning. You destroyed 3 vessels. We reflected 3 volleys. The ships destroyed themselves in a technical sense." She refilled his cup. He had mentioned once that he preferred it stronger and set the pot down without making a point of it. "We didn't want to. We genuinely didn't. We'd have preferred you just turned around. Why didn't you destroy the entire fleet? You had the capability." She looked at him steadily. "Yes," she said simply, "we did." He held the silence for a moment, and then asked the question he'd been building toward for 2 days. "How long have you known about us?" Chen set down her cup. 63 years, she said. "We detected your first long-range observation probe in 2063. Took us about 18 months to decode the telemetry. After that, we monitored your monitoring of us." She smiled slightly. "You're very thorough. Your annual reports on our species are actually quite good. Mostly." Rel sat very still. "The assassins. We knew they were coming 4 days before they landed. The Voakai. We knew that was coming too." She paused. "Gerald is doing well, by the way. He's living on a farm in New Zealand. The family is very attached to him." "Why," Rel said slowly, "did you allow all of it? The weapons, the spies, the fleet at your border. You could have revealed yourselves at any point. You could have contacted us 60 years ago. Why didn't you?" Chen Wei looked out the viewport at the stars for a moment. Then she looked back at him, and Rel realized, with a jolt of something he couldn't quite name, that her expression wasn't triumphant or strategic or even particularly diplomatic. It was sad. "We wanted to see," she said quietly, "if you'd figure it out on your own." The files took 3 days to transfer. Not because of bandwidth. The connection between Earth's intelligence servers and the Conclave's decryption mainframe was, by that point, running at full capacity. It took 3 days because the files were vast. Not in the way military intelligence is vast. Not rows of weapon specs and tactical assessments and population data. They were vast in the way a library is vast, the way a record of a civilization's entire interior life is vast. Rel sat in the reading room of the joint station and worked through them with two of his senior analysts, and by the end of the first day, both analysts had asked to be relieved of the assignment, not because the material was distressing, because it was too much to hold. The first file was the one that reset everything. It was a historical record, a proper academic one, peer-reviewed, cross-referenced, compiled from oral traditions, genetic archaeology, artifact analysis. The subject was human history, all of it, not the part that began with cities and writing and agriculture, which was where the conclave's own profile of humanity had started, the part that came before. 200,000 years. The conclave's oldest member civilization had a continuous recorded history of 40,000 years, and they were considered ancient beyond measure, a people who carried the weight of deep time in their customs and their silences. Humanity's recorded history, even just the oral portion, the stories passed from mouth to ear across countless generations, stretched back 5 times further. And almost none of it was about expansion. Every other spacefaring civilization in the conclave had followed the same broad arc: survival, agriculture, industry, warfare, nation-states, then the reach outward to orbit, to the moon, to planets, to stars. The drive was always the same: more space, more resources, more room, the universe as a frontier to be crossed and claimed. Humanity had the same drive. The data was unambiguous about that. They felt it, the same pull toward the horizon that had launched 1,000 civilizations into the dark. They had simply chosen, for most of their history, to redirect it inward. The second file was the psychology corpus. Rel had expected something clinical, behavioral studies, neurological research. Instead, he found himself reading what amounted to a civilization's 200,000-year conversation with itself about the nature of consciousness, suffering, connection, and meaning. Philosophy, yes, but not the abstract philosophy of beings trying to understand the universe from a distance. This was the philosophy of a species obsessed with the question of how to be present inside an experience, how to be with another person in a way that was real rather than performed, how to face the thing that frightened you without being consumed by it. They had developed more frameworks for the study of the interior human experience than the conclave had developed weapons systems, more rigorously, more seriously, with more cumulative investment over more centuries. The Volcae had not been neutralized. Rel understood this now completely, sitting in the reading room with files spread across 3 screens. The Volcae had encountered a species that recognized, on some level it couldn't articulate, what was underneath the terror it projected. Loneliness, perhaps. A creature that had never in its existence encountered something that didn't run from it. And the humans, who had spent longer than most civilizations, had existed studying exactly what loneliness felt like and what it needed, had simply responded to that. Not as a strategy, as a reflex. The shades had not been defeated. They had been seen. Each one, in their separate way, had encountered a human who looked at them and somehow perceived the actual person underneath the operative, the childhood, the loss, the very specific shape of the absence that had made them into what they were. And for individuals who had spent their entire lives being invisible, who had been built specifically to be unknowable, that recognition had been more destabilizing than any physical force could have managed. Rel read until the 3rd day, and somewhere in the middle of a file on the human concept of compassion, not as an ethical principle, but as a neurological phenomenon, a literal capacity to temporarily model another being's internal state as your own, to feel what they felt from the inside, he stopped reading. He sat quietly for a long time. Then he called his lead analyst and said, "Pull together everything we need for a full membership proposal. I want it ready before I sleep tonight." The analyst paused. "Sir, the Chancellor hasn't authorized." "I know," Rel said. "Do it anyway. I'll handle the Chancellor." He closed the file. Outside the viewport, Earth turned in its slow rotation, blue and white and green, unhurried, going nowhere in particular, having apparently decided some time ago that the most interesting territory in the universe was the one that existed between one person and another. Rel looked at it for a long time and felt, with a clarity he had rarely experienced in 400 years of life, that he had spent most of those years asking the wrong questions entirely. The vote was the most watched event in conclave history. Every member civilization had feeds running to their home systems. The viewing numbers, calculated in the hours afterward, were staggering. Nearly 4 billion individuals across 17 civilizations had watched the chamber in real time, had watched the High Chancellor call the motion, had watched the tally boards illuminate one by one. The motion, full membership of humanity in the galactic conclave, effective immediately, with all rights and responsibilities thereof. 13 in favor, 4 against. The 4 that voted no were not irrational. Rel had spent 2 weeks speaking with each of their delegates, and he understood their position clearly. Fear was a reasonable response to encountering something you couldn't defeat on any conventional terms. The instinct to maintain distance from something you couldn't understand was not stupidity. It was caution, the same caution that had kept those civilizations alive through centuries of interstellar politics. But there was a difference, Rel had come to understand, between caution and the thing these 4 civilizations were actually feeling. Caution was about the future. What they felt was something older than strategy, a deep, unexamined certainty that the universe was a hierarchy, that power was the primary language of reality, and that any species which could not be placed within that hierarchy was therefore a threat. Humanity had not threatened anyone. They had defended themselves when attacked, efficiently and with minimum necessary force. They had revealed nothing about their capabilities until those capabilities were tested against them. They had, for 63 years, watched the conclave prepare to destroy them, and had responded not with preemptive strikes or political maneuvering, but with open doors and strong coffee and genuine, patient, slightly amused willingness to talk. The 4 civilizations that voted no were afraid, and what they were afraid of at the root of it, underneath all the strategic language and civilizational threat assessments, was being known, being seen the way the shades had been seen, being looked at by something that was very good at looking and having nothing left to hide behind. Ambassador Chen's acceptance speech was short. She stood in the chamber, the first human to do so, though she carried herself as though she had been here before, as though this room were familiar rather than historic, and she said, "We've been waiting a long time for this conversation. Not because we needed it, we would have been fine either way, but because we think better together than apart, and we've always believed that. We look forward to learning from you. We suspect you'll find, if you're willing, that there's quite a lot here worth learning." She paused. Also, Gerald would like it noted that he considers himself a conclave citizen and expects the appropriate documentation. The chamber broke into the sound that only 4 billion years of biological evolution across 17 different species can produce when they all find something genuinely funny at the same time. It was a good sound. In New Zealand, on a Tuesday morning in early autumn, a girl named Mia sat in a sunlit field with her back against something warm and enormous. A book was open in her lap, but she'd stopped reading 20 minutes ago and was just watching the light move through the leaves of the trees at the field's edge. The slow, patient way it changed, gold becoming green, becoming gold again. Behind her, Gerald breathed in slow, oceanic rhythms, each exhale a low subsonic hum she felt more than heard. She had grown up with him. She didn't remember the time before, the way adults in her family talked about the time before, with a kind of held breath, a significance she was too young to have experienced. For her, Gerald had simply always been there, the way the hills had always been there, the way her grandmother's voice on the phone had always been there. She reached back without looking and pressed her palm flat against his hide. He made the sound, the low one, the one her mother cried the first time she heard it, which Mia had always found confusing and now, at 11, was beginning to understand. Somewhere in the dark between stars, The four civilizations that had voted no were having long, uncomfortable meetings. Their intelligence services were filing reports. Their philosophers were being quietly consulted. Their populations, who had watched the same feeds, read the same analyses, and were asking many of the same questions their leaders weren't ready to answer, were beginning to talk amongst themselves in ways that made the people in power nervous. It would take time. These things always did. But the Conclave had sent its deadliest weapons against humanity. The Volkai, 3 centuries in the making. A fleet of 300 warships commanded by its greatest admiral. 7 operatives built from childhood to be unbreakable and unknowable. Not one had come back the same. The Volkai lay in a field, with a child asleep against his flank. The admiral had submitted a request for a diplomatic posting. The Shades had asked, each one separately and without coordination, the same question: is there someone I can talk to? This was the thing about humanity that the Conclave's weapons models had never accounted for, because it couldn't be quantified, couldn't be mapped onto a threat matrix or entered into a tactical simulation. You could engineer around a weapon. You could build countermeasures for a technology. You could prepare for force. You couldn't build a countermeasure for being genuinely cared about. You couldn't defend against a species that looked at the actual you, underneath all the armor and the doctrine and the civilizational identity, and said simply, "We see you. We're not afraid. Sit down." They had deployed their deadliest weapons against humanity. Nothing ever returned. Not because it was destroyed. Because it didn't want to leave.